one of my themes kind of this decade is that I think inflation on average is here to stay for quite a while. But I've also been reiterating that it's not going to be a straight line, most likely. I mean, the 40s and 70s, you didn't have inflation in a straight line. You had disinflationary periods within inflationary decades. And I wouldn't be surprised to see the same thing here in the 2020s. You can get an inflationary spike, and then you can kind of come back down if you start to suppress demand or you fix some of the supply side issues. But until you actually resolve more completely the underlying problem, I think that it's like holding a beach ball underwater. As soon as you let it go, it's bound to want to come back up. That's kind of back in the prior decade, it's like markets had a tendency to want to disinflate just because you had overcapacity, oversupply for oil, things like that. And I think we're in the opposite environment now, where the tendency is to want to inflate because we have underinvested in a lot of real assets. And so even though we might suppress that for periods of time, I think the longer term trend is still, probably higher commodity and higher inflation on average than we had the past decade. And so I had that article about the area under the curve. It was actually a friend of mine in market that made that quote. So I decided to turn that into a piece. And essentially, it's the idea that, everyone's looking at the price of oil, for example, and they're saying, is it going to go to 150? Is it going to fall down to, is it going to go back down? And my point was that if you're a long-term investor, it's not really about what oil does in the next few months. Whether it's 150 or not, or goes back down to like 80, is irrelevant. And instead, it's about what is the average price going to be, I think, over the next 5 to 10 years. And so my general theme is that even at current levels, even when oil is at 90, 100, 120, or if it goes up from there, that is just an ongoing cost for households and for businesses. And eventually you get more and more realignment towards those things. And so, for example, energy pipelines, oil producers, companies like that, even at current price levels and current volume levels with current valuations, they're actually pretty attractive if you look at them out kind of a longer term perspective. And so the challenge with investing in commodities is always that, in the very long term, they're not great asset class compared to what else you get. They're not these like long-term compounders. Disinflation happens more often than inflation. So there are more decades than not where commodities are not great investments. And then even in inflationary decades, you can have some pretty violent volatility among them, even as they outperform. And so I think that having commodities and value-oriented things long term, this decade is probably going to be very helpful, as it already has been. But I think investors have to be prepared for those huge shocks that can come along the way, those downward moves in what is otherwise like an inflationary structure. I think it's very interesting. And I agree with your point that basically people are very invested in disinflationary assets, right? So the 60-40 portfolio, as we know it, is a pretty, it really benefits from disinflation. Generally, it's in the 60 stock side, you're more in growth stocks than value stocks, and growth stocks tend to want a disinflationary environment. And then you have the 40, which is in, paper assets. It's in, again, things that benefit from disinflation. And so what really disrupts, and we've had, 40 years of a downward trend in interest rates, a downward trend in inflation. And out of those 4 decades, 3 of them were just outright disinflationary, right? So, the 80s, 90s, and the 2010s were all these kind of disinflationary decades. We did have one inflationary decade of the 2000s, but we had so many globalization levers that we could kind of pull so that we didn't really get the brunt of that inflation in the way that we did in kind of prior commodity bull markets like that. And so I do think that, in this period, investors are they have a lot of recency bias built around these kind of compounding things that benefit from disinflation. And I do think that it is good to have some inflationary slices in a portfolio to kind of offset some of those disinflationary assets. It doesn't mean someone has to be 100% in them, but I do think that, just like we saw this year, stocks and bonds went down together while energy went up. And that was an example of where, it's almost like energy became the thing you want to own that offsets your other stuff instead of stocks and bonds offsetting each other. That tends to be a theme in inflationary types of decades where stocks and bonds are more correlated than we might otherwise like. And instead it's commodities and real assets that tend to be the diversifier. So if you have a period of inflation, you'll generally have your stocks and bonds probably not doing great while those commodities are doing quite well. And then if you get a disinflationary pullback within that decade, you could have a period where your commodities and real assets are doing pretty poorly and your stocks and bonds are bouncing back. And so I do think that in a diversified portfolio, having at least a slice towards those real assets or commodity assets or those types of inflationary assets, I think is super useful. And I think that that will probably end up being the difference between underperformance and outperformance this decade, is whether or not a diversified portfolio has that slice in it or not.
Before we continue, help us clicking that YouTube like button and subscribe now to our channel. This shows the algorithm that you valued this information. And it helps us spread that message. Sharing is caring. And now, let's continue.
I have bad news for you. If you're not rich by now, you're screwed. And if you're in debt, you're even double screwed. How so, you might wonder? Well, the sad truth is that you're working your whole life to make someone else rich. The mega corporations, the banks, the politicians, everyone is getting richer. They get your money. And what is even worse, they get your time, they get your life. You are not even in a rat race. You're in a financial prison. But what could a solution for you look like? Honestly, I don't know, but I know what a solution for me would look like. It's very simple. I use whatever money I have and I multiply it with 1,000. This could make my life much easier and probably yours as well. If you have $1,000 available and multiply this with 1,000, I believe that this could solve some financial issue for the one or the other. Of course, if you're ugly, you would have to multiply it with much more than 1,000. My name is Markus Dahn, and this is what I decided to do. I decided to 1000x my money. This is not a joke. I know what you may be thinking. What is this guy talking about? How should this work? This is not possible. Well, I made a detailed video where I laid out my plan. And some clever folks might even want to look at this plan and copy it and do exactly what I do. This is just a little hint on the side. You have two options. You leave, you forget what you have seen. You do whatever you're doing and you hope that somehow you get some other results. Good luck with that. Or you click the link below the video. You enter your email address, because I'm not showing this to everybody. You at least watch my video on how I plan to 1000x my money. The choice is yours. Make the right choice. Join me. See what a different future you could have. See at least how I intend, how I plan to do the 1000x. So click on the link below, enter your email address, and I see you on the other side. Your Markus Dahn.